But I don't think they're flattering to deceive. I think people that are projecting what Newcastle are going to achieve, including that Wally Jim White, who's bet me £1,000 they're going to finish 6th in the league, and I'll take that money in advance, Jim, if you want to pay it now. Welcome to this week's edition of One to One with Simon Jordan. Don't forget to keep liking and subscribing, but equally as important, in fact more importantly, keep leaving those brilliant questions in the comment section below. But let's get to this week's show. I think there was always a conventional wisdom that suggested that West Ham, having achieved heights in the last 2 seasons, specifically last season, might find themselves in a little bit of a dip-off in form. Obviously, David Moyes was a little critical of his team yesterday or over the weekend in their performance against Everton, and you would have expected him to get something out of that game because Everton are not a good side. But notwithstanding that, you have to give credit to Everton to get the results. I sincerely hope not. I think David Moyes, despite the fact that I believe that managers should be judged in the here and now, and you have to look at what they've done for you lately rather than what they've done for you in the past, but you also have to get balance. So if I were to suggest that David Moyes should be under any pressure, I think that would be foolish. I think they do need to get themselves together. They're not hitting their straps. And David is complicit in that as much as the players. But do I think that West Ham will right their ship? Of course I do. They've spent some money. Always the way, when expectations increase, you have to manage those expectations. But even if the expectations weren't there, in terms of there was a reality and a grounded set of thinking at West Ham, you'd still have to say that the current form isn't where they need it to be. They're not miles off. They're just not where they were, let's say, 7 months ago. But David has spoken about the feelings that they had punched high last year. He felt that there was a dipping off. They needed to invest, and that the momentum of the Europa League last year had carried them to a certain level. But he could see that there was a need to invest. Well, they've invested, David, so now you need to get this squad and these group of players focusing in the right way. And I'm pretty sure he will. So the answer to your question is, if there's a silliness in the air, then David will be under pressure. If there's common sense prevailing, which is a commodity that's quite rare in football at times, then he won't be. But it doesn't last forever. So David does need to start getting this team together and start getting a few outcomes rather than saying we're not that far away. I don't think Leicester will go down, but I do think that there are the rumblings now of the beginning of the end for Brendan, not because it's as plain as a nose on your face, sort of they've lost 6 games in a bounce, because there appears to be a contrition and an acceptance, a tacit acceptance in Brendan. It's one thing being relaxed, it's one thing not being caught up in the media circus and all the emotion and sentiment of people screaming abuse at you because your team's losing, or certain sections of the media writing your obituary. But Brendan's response over the weekend was calm and collected, and I like it, but it was also almost like an acceptance of what he perceived to be the inevitable. There wasn't any defiance in his outlook. There wasn't a pushback or resistance. There was the same diplomatic approach to how the team had played, how far away they were, and then this relaxed and calm demeanour and disposition to the questioning about his future. I like that in one respect because it doesn't give some journalist seeking to ask difficult questions, or what he or she thinks is difficult questions, a piece of wool they can pull at and make it into more of an interview. But I don't like it from the other point of view, that it wasn't a robust, shoulders back, chest out, we'll fix this sort of mentality. I think that Brendan has a good relationship with the people at Leicester. I'm not entirely sure that the ownership model is as committed economically, and that's understandable, by the way, as they once were. So all of those things play into a narrative that puts Brendan under pressure. Do I think he's done? I think he's nigh on done. They've got a group of games that maybe he'll be given latitude on after the international break, Forest being the key game in people's minds, because obviously this time in the FA Cup at the beginning of the year this year, they were poor giving up their FA Cup and getting knocked out to Leicester, knocked out to Nottingham Forest in the FA Cup, and he was very disparaging of the group of players, telling everyone that it needed to be broken up. So it'll be an irony if they can't right that ship against Nottingham Forest in the next game back. They've got a group of games that they will think they can get some results out of. He'll either be given the benefit of the doubt for those games and see what he can pull together, or the international break will prove his demise. I can't call it. I think he'll be given those games. But notwithstanding that, I still think the writing's on the wall. I think his time is coming to an end at Leicester, one way or another. I don't think Leicester are going to operate at a level that would be akin with expectations. So I think Brendan is on his last waltz at Leicester. Well, UEFA are put forward as these guardians of the game. These individuals, or this entity, sorry, that looks after the best interests of football because of their perceived status after the European Super League. They're just another organisation that profits out of the endeavours of football and has their own view on how football should be run. I'm not a fan of UEFA. I'm not a fan of their incumbent leadership. They are a very lucrative business model, and the challenge is that they're under pressure to develop other opportunities for other European leagues that can't keep up with the domestic powerhouse that is the Premier League. So not only are they increasing the Champions League, not only are they trying to suggest that coefficients will allow teams to go into that competition that haven't actually qualified, which doesn't that smack of lack of merit, and doesn't that smack of something else? Oh, I know, the European Super League. They will be driving forward the opportunity for other angles of revenue. And the Premier League has no need for it, and no more than it needs the 39th game. So I'm not enamoured with it. I'm not enamoured with the Champions League, which, by the way, isn't the Champions League, because most of the teams that play in it aren't actually champions. I'm not enamoured with UEFA as a fiefdom that thinks it has some dictate and control over football, as we saw recently with the ridiculous announcement that UEFA were dictating to English clubs playing in the Champions League that they couldn't actually play the national anthem to celebrate the passing of their late Queen. That's what I think of UEFA. So what I think of their ideas of expanding this to North America or taking it wherever they can to play these Champions League games will help the clubs that constantly carp and bitch and whine about how powerful the Premier League is. And we can name those clubs: Real Madrid, Barcelona, Javier Tebas, Juventus, etc., etc., etc. So no, I'm not in favour of it. It's a Champions League played in Europe amongst European teams. It's already generating a significant amount of revenue. UEFA are already profiting from it. So this is a power grab, potentially to balance off against the FIFA World Club Championships. So no, thank you very much. If I was Eddie Hearn in some parallel universe, would I be advising Anthony Joshua to take this fight or not take this fight? Well, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Sometimes you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. But it depends whether that horse is about to bite you when you're feeding it a particular carrot. I think that Anthony is incredibly fortunate to get this opportunity, because I think he could have spent 18 months, 2 years in the wilderness, sort of trawling around with Eddie Hearn trying to pump him up through DAZN to get some of the investment back that possibly they're having to put into him to put him on DAZN in the first place. I think it's an incredibly difficult fight for him to win, because I think Tyson Fury is a better fighter than Anthony Joshua. I know that Tyson inhaled deeply and then exhaled some observations of my view that fighting Anthony Joshua will be a more difficult fight than Deontay Wilder. I think it will, because I think Anthony Joshua is technically a better fighter. He can fight in certain ways that Deontay Wilder cannot. Deontay Wilder cannot fight going backwards. But it's about whether Anthony is prepared to go into the trenches and do what he did against Klitschko, which was be prepared to not so much die, because that's over-exaggerating it, but go to a very dark place in the Klitschko fight, in the same way that Wilder was prepared to do whatever it took against Fury in the third fight. He didn't have enough, but he was prepared to go to a dark place. So with that in mind, the way that the fight has been framed, the structure of the fight, Joshua would be in a very difficult position to turn it down. Can he win this fight? Yeah, he can win this fight. Will he win this fight? I don't think so, albeit the conspiracy theorist in me thinks people could make this fight into an even bigger fight if Joshua were to win, because then they'd get a second fight and that might find its way into the Middle East. I think Eddie Hearn doesn't control Anthony Joshua's ship. He isn't the captain on the starboard bow telling him which way to go. So I think Anthony Joshua feels that there's an opportunity here, and I think Anthony Joshua will determine that, and it's really very little to do with Eddie Hearn, besides it's under the framework of Eddie Hearn, and he'll get paid from it. So I think that it's one of those where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. are Newcastle flattering to deceive? No, I think Newcastle have looked very good this season. I've been very impressed with them. I've admired the way they've played against Liverpool. I admired the way they played against Man City. I think they're a work in progress. I think it's very difficult. Manchester City, when they got all this money, didn't win the league for a few years. I think they finished 8th when the money started to really crank up. I think Eddie Howe is doing a decent job. I think they've made decent signings. I've been quite impressed, despite my vitriol about the ownership and my distaste for some of the people that have been involved with Newcastle. You've got to give credit where credit's due. They've got a decent buying policy. People like Kieran Trippier have been outstanding. People make this observation that I said he was only going for the money. I didn't say that. I said he wouldn't be going there if there wasn't the prerequisite amount of money and opportunity. He says that he's getting the same money as he's getting Atletico at Madrid or less. I would suggest that perhaps he's getting better opportunities by being at Newcastle for a variety of different reasons, and some of them are economic and some of them might be longer term contracts. But notwithstanding that, he's been an absolute revelation. So are some of the other players. I thought they bought well. People are going to compare the situation against Eddie Howe's previous charges, Bournemouth, because they've just drawn a game and they didn't play brilliantly in that game. I think that's because players like Alan St-Maximin are so important to them. They've got to build a more balanced team. But I don't think they're flattering to deceive. I think people that are projecting what Newcastle are going to achieve, including that Wally Jim White, who's bet me £1,000 they're going to finish 6th in the league, and I'll take that money in advance, Jim, if you want to pay it now, are unrealistic. I think Newcastle are building, going through the gears. They're an attacking, offensively, easy on the eye, well-balanced side, and I enjoy watching them. And I think there's just a bit of reality stepping in between what people expect them to do and what they're capable of doing. They've not got Callum Wilson, and I know they've bought the boy Isak, and they've got other players in the mix that they've spent a lot of money on. I think that Newcastle are going in the right direction. I do hope there isn't rumblings from Newcastle about people within their fan base not being particularly happy, because this time last year they would have bitten their own arms off to have a different ownership and a different direction, a different manager, and they've got all that. So be patient. Newcastle are going in the right direction on many, many fronts. And despite the fact that they've not won as many games as people would expect them to have done, in fact, I think they've won very few, but they've been very, very engaging in all the games they've played. And given most of the sides they've played, specifically Man City and Liverpool, an absolute run for their money, I think just be patient with Newcastle. I'm enjoying watching them. I'm enjoying the development of the team. I'm pleasantly surprised by the manner in which they've operated. And I think they set themselves out for a launch pad for the building of a football club that can compete over the ensuing years. So no, I don't think they're flattered to deceive, and I'm not going to pile in like people think I would because it's Newcastle. So I've got more encouraging words to say to Newcastle than I've got discouraging ones. Right, that's it for this week's edition of One-to-One with Simon Jordan. Don't forget to let me know your views on West Ham, Brendan Rodgers, Newcastle, and of course Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury. Keep liking and subscribing, and of course keep leaving those questions in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you next week.